The Other Side of the Rosen, written by J.C. Cooker. The human race breathed a sigh of relief when we finally colonized Mars. Years of overpopulation and resource shortages left our first planet stressed. Mars was seen as a pressure valve, a new planet for us to build up and eventually ruin, but we all knew it wasn't a permanent solution. With the way our population grows, it would only give us a finite amount of time before we were in the same boat as before. We needed more planets that are farther away and host a greater abundance of resources. To achieve this, humanity created a breakthrough. Using artificial gravity, we were able to bend space and create wormholes. This, in theory, would allow us to travel large distances instantaneously, spreading humanity throughout the cosmos. After years of development, the first ever spacecraft with wormhole travel technology was developed. Initial unmanned tests were incredibly promising, and soon the first ever manned wormhole trip was set to begin. The ship, named the Rosen, was set out on a 5-month voyage to travel from Earth to Mars. Once there, the crew of around 40 were set to activate the wormhole generator and travel back to Earth instantaneously. Everyone knew there were risks, but the developers and engineers were confident in their invention. The day came, and I remember staring at the monitor as the news reporter droned on about the historical precedent of the mission. I drank my coffee from its pouch and watched as the countdown began. The camera changed to a split-screen satellite view of space. One half of the screen showed the Rosen sitting in orbit around Mars, and the second half was a view of space around Earth. When the countdown hit 0, the ship suddenly blinked between the two screens. In an instant, soundlessly, the massive ship traveled over 100 million miles. While I heard the news reporter and people around her celebrating the massive achievement, I squinted my eyes at the screen, noticing the small details they didn't. The ship had gone dark. The navigation lights seemed to have turned off as it passed through the wormhole. Furthermore, the engines looked cool, not emitting the normal blue glow that they normally do. The automated door to my pod opened, and my coworker Desmond stuck his head in and grimaced. "You're going to be needed up front," Desmond said in his thick Irish accent. I groaned and rolled out of the pod. Peering out the windows of the ship, I could see the Rosen sitting off in the distance. The ship sat in the same orbit of Earth as us, just as dark as it appeared on the screen. As I entered the command room of the ship, I could hear a loud rhythmic beeping coming from the communication panel. I could see Peter and Marcus running remote diagnostics and communicating with our command team back on Earth. "Good to see you're awake," Peter chimed. I yawned and nodded, gesturing to the control panel as it continued to loudly beep. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Marcus said. "When the Rosen made the jump, it came out the other side blaring a distress signal. Despite the signal, we can't reach the crew on comms for whatever reason. We called command and they said the ship wasn't distressed until it reached our side, and then there's the ship going dark. Command is wondering if the jump didn't have any unforeseen reaction with nuclear engines, causing the blackout, or some other electrical malfunction." "That ship has made how many unmanned jumps?" Desmond interrupted. "It came out fine every other time. I'm telling you, one of those pilots had a royal cock-up and caused this." "Yeah, well, that doesn't really matter now," Peter said, taking off his communication headphones and walking away from the comms panel. "Command told us to go in through the emergency airlock and provide assistance to the crew on getting the Rosen repaired. The sooner the better, they said." "Fuck me," Desmond said, throwing up his hands. "So much for an easy paycheck." The ride over to the Rosen was incredibly short. I remember seeing the massive monolith of the ship towering over our small repair freighter. Despite the crew on board only numbering around 40, the ship itself was designed to support hundreds of passengers as well as their cargo. Our freighter shook violently as we docked into the airlock. Peter typed away on the panel by the large hatch, encrypting his key card with the needed requirements to access restricted areas on the Rosen. The first set of doors opened, revealing the bright white interior of the airlock. The 4 of us stepped inside as the hatch behind us closed and the hatch into the Rosen opened. The opening hallway of the Rosen was dark with the exception of small emergency lights illuminating the hallways and rooms. "You'd think we'd be getting some kind of greeting," Desmond muttered. "We are saving their asses after all." "Come on," Peter said, clicking on his flashlight and looking at his map monitor on his wrist. "We'll find someone and have them explain what's going on." We traveled down the winding hallways of the massive ship, occasionally calling out but receiving no response. The eerie appearance of the empty ship began to settle on us. A palpable tension was building with every echoing footstep down the hall. We rounded a corner to see a human figure standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was shrouded in the darkness that enveloped the whole ship, forbidding us from getting a good view. "Hello?" Peter called out. "It's good to see another person on here. We were worried for a second." The figure didn't move or speak, leaving us to sit in an awkward silence. "You all right, sir?" Peter asked as he walked down the hallway. I glanced over at Marcus and Desmond, seeing the confused and worried expression that we were all sharing. As Peter stepped closer, he was suddenly struck still as more of the man's features came into view of the light. He was completely naked and facing away from us. I felt my stomach churn at the sight of him. His entire body was covered in holes of all shapes and sizes. Some of the holes would slightly flex and wave like the muscles around them were contracting. He looked as though a corpse had been turned into a wasp nest. Inside each hole I could see a small white object that was surrounded by a fleshy red meat. As the light cast over his shoulder, the man slowly turned to face us, his face riddled with smaller holes. "Holy shit," Desmond whispered as he stepped back. The man's eyes grew wide and wild as he began silently shambling towards us. Peter stretched out his arm and began backing away. "Hey, man," he said. "You're sick. I'm going to need you to stand." Before he could finish, the man lunged forward head first, his arms flailing at his side as if he had no control over them. As he lunged, the holes in the man's head produced deep, red tendrils. At the tips of each tendril were the white objects that I could now see were what looked like hooked porcupine quills. Peter dodged the incoming attack and the man slammed onto the ground. Marcus reared back to kick him, but Peter stopped him. "Don't touch him, look!" Peter yelled, pointing to the holes on the man's sides and back, now protruding those barbs. Before an argument could be had, the man on the floor jumped to his feet and pounced on top of Desmond. We watched in horror as the tendrils shot from the man's body and into Desmond's flesh. Desmond screamed and attempted to push the man off of him, but it appeared the tendrils just pulled tighter and tighter. I watched as the tendrils would retract and shoot back out into Desmond's skin, burrowing holes into his body. Peter and Marcus stood back in shock and horror, not knowing what to do to get the man off of Desmond without being struck by the flailing barbs that rose from the man's body. Looking at the man, I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. Out of the man's left leg, I noticed a long tendril that extended out of one of the holes and down the hall, rounding the corner. Without thinking, I dropped down to my hands and knees and grabbed hold of the long tendril. It was warm and I could feel it pulsing in my hand like a large vein. I tightened both hands around it and began pulling it apart. The vein flexed and stretched like a gummy worm before snapping with a sickening pop. The man on Desmond suddenly flailed back, all of its tendrils retracting back into its body. The thing lurched to its feet, its arms still drooped at its sides. We prepared for another attack, but the man seemed to just walk aimlessly into the walls of the hallway as though it was suddenly blind. I was so focused on the man that I didn't even notice Marcus running up behind him. Marcus raised up the large wrench he had retrieved from his tool pack and brought it down on the back of the man's skull. The man fell to the ground, and Marcus hit his head over and over. After a few hits, the man's head was just a pile of mush, but his body was still struggling to get back up. I looked down to see Desmond bleeding profusely from his dozens of wounds. I knelt down beside him, but I knew there wasn't anything I could do. "Oh my God," Peter mumbled under his breath. I looked back to see 6 more people wandering down the hallway, all covered in holes. "We need to get into a locked room now," Peter yelled. "Grab Desmond, let's go." Marcus and I dropped to Desmond's side, grabbing him by the shoulders and dragging him away from the approaching horde. Peter ran to the nearest room and placed his keycard on the scanner. The scanner dinged and the door slid open. We quickly pulled Desmond into the room, his screams of pain echoing down the hall and causing my ears to ring. Once on the inside, Peter used his keycard to shut the door, typing in a code on the scanner to activate the room's locking mechanism. I glanced around the room, seeing that we had ended up in a large supply room. I quickly looked through the items at our disposal, searching for anything that could help Desmond's injuries. "What the hell was that, Peter?" Marcus said, kneeling by Desmond. I don't know," Peter murmured under his breath. We could hear the horde outside slapping their bodies against the door. "I mean, was that the crew?" Marcus's voice shook. "I don't know, Marcus," Peter shouted as he hovered his hands over Desmond's mutilated body. "Some of these holes got through the rib cage. We need something to stop the bleeding." Desmond had stopped screaming by now. Perhaps he had gone into shock. I found a small first aid kit and began running to Desmond's side. Looking back, I should have known it wouldn't do much to help. His wounds were too extensive, but holding that little white box filled me with so much hope. I froze when I reached his side, his glossed-over eyes and pale skin staring at me. Desmond was already dead. Before any of us could say a word, a new sound emanated from the door, a low buzzer sound followed by the metallic clicking of the locking mechanism. We slowly rose to our feet, a cold chill running down my spine as I recognized the sound. "Oh my God," Peter whispered. "They're trying codes." "They aren't getting it right." Marcus turned to Peter. "Maybe they don't know the override code." "We aren't sticking around to find out," Peter announced. "Get the pry bar out of your tool kit." Peter took the tool from Marcus and went to the opposite side of the room. He pushed the contents off the shelves in order to climb up to the large air vent. While he worked, I looked around the storage room for anything I might use as a weapon, eventually finding a small tool bag that contained an average-sized pocket knife. It wouldn't do much, but it was something. Using the pry bar, Peter popped of the opening to the ventilation shaft before calling us over. We filed into the ventilation shaft. It was cool, cramped, and dark in the vents. The floor and walls creaked and squealed as we shimmied through them. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked. Peter looked down at his wrist monitor and scrolled along the map of the ship. "There might be an air vent near the airlock," Peter replied. "We can shimmy back and get into our ship. We'll call command and let them deal with this." The trek back went by quickly. Adrenaline was still pumping through us all. As we moved along the vent, I heard the distinct sound of the generator kicking on. The ship's electrical power appeared to have been restored. We could see light shining through slats up ahead that Peter pointed out as the vent near the airlock. Once we reached the exit vent, Peter froze as he looked through the slats of the vent. "Shit," he whispered. I looked through the slats to see a mass of infected humans huddled around the airlock entrance, their bodies riddled with the pulsing holes of the ones before. "Why the fuck are they here?" Marcus asked quietly. "They must have known we'd come back," Peter whispered, his brow furrowed as he watched them. Without warning, Peter drew back his fist and punched the side of the ventilation shaft. The loud bang caused Marcus and I to jump in fear. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus whispered. "Look," Peter said plainly, pointing at the slats. We looked out to see that the infected hadn't moved, hadn't reacted at all to the sudden loud noise. "These vents make a lot of noise as we travel through the," Peter explained, his eyes narrowing. "They would have heard us a while ago." "Why didn't they react?" Marcus asked. "The one we faced down the hall," Peter replied, his voice no longer concealed in whispers. "It didn't react to us until the light flashed over its shoulder, until there was a visual stimulus. I think they're deaf." "Then how do you explain the horde coming down the hall once we started screaming?" Marcus retorted. "Maybe they weren't attracted by the sound. Maybe they have a way of communicating without talking." Peter's finger slowly moved down the slats, pointing to the single large tendrils that extended out of each person and traveled down the hall in the same direction. "Well, if you're right," Marcus continued, "how does that help us?" "I don't know yet," Peter answered, looking at his wrist monitor. But we aren't getting to the ship now. We need to make our way to the Rosen's command center. We'll get communication back online and have Earth send help. Maybe we'll find someone who can give us some answers. We began working our way towards the command entrance of the ship. I could feel the shock of the situation wearing off, and a horrible dread setting in. I didn't want to go further into the ship, I doubt any of us did, but what choice did we have? We passed alongside one of the cramped engine rooms. I looked through the slats of the vent to see multiple infected people huddled in the room. Their grotesque bodies moved erratically against the machinery. Some seemed to be holding tools, while others had their hands slapped onto monitors, their fingers snapping awkwardly as they appeared to type. "What are they doing?" Marcus asked. We sat in silence for a long moment, observing them before Peter's shaky voice piped up. "They're trying to repair the ship." My eyes widened as I finally noticed what Peter had. It was rudimentary and wrong, like a child mimicking a mechanic. But he was right. They were trying to do maintenance. "How is that possible?" Marcus asked. "How do they know to do that?" "Maybe they maintain some kind of memory," Peter answered. "They could be acting out repetitive actions. Same with trying the codes on the door, muscle memory." "Why would they want to get the ship's engines running?" Marcus questioned. "Where the hell do they plan to go?" "I don't know. Maybe—" Peter stopped himself. I looked over at Peter. I could see his hands shaking. He was a team leader and was doing everything to maintain his composure, but I could see it on his face. He was terrified. "We need to make contact with command as soon as possible," Peter whispered. "Let's go." We continued down the path. I followed Peter's orders as he told me where to go at each fork in the vents. The map system on Peter's wrist monitor didn't show the ventilation tracks, but it allowed us a basic sense of direction when compared to the hallways and rooms we moved alongside. After a while, I could feel fatigue setting in. Crawling through the vents on my hands and knees was taking a toll on my body. As we moved, the vents suddenly felt flimsy underneath me. Each movement was met with the metal plates flexing and buckling under our weight. A loud banging and creaking sound was let out with each advancement. We passed by a large set of slats that gave a great view of the outside area. I felt like my heart stopped as I looked out. We were suspended over a large mess hall. The chairs and tables had all been pushed out to the side, leaving the center of the room spacious and bare. There were many infected people in this room. They stood almost motionless, only giving a slight sway to each side. They stood around a large object that was fastened in the center of the room. The thing in that room was a mass of horrible ruin, a large viscous blob with large root-like extremities holding it to the floor. Its surface was a mix of deep red muscles, protruding bone, and hairy skin. Like the infected crew, the mass was covered in pulsing holes. Parts of the skin would expand and contract rhythmically, as though the mass was breathing. Off each root-like structure sprouted hundreds of long red tendrils. Most were small and slowly writhed along the ground, but others were long, stretching out of the room completely. I looked at the people standing around the room. I could see a tendril attached to each of them. It extended out of their body and connected them to the mass. Before any of us could say a word, we heard footsteps approaching from underneath us. We looked down to see two more infected people walking into the room. I heard Peter's breath hitch as we saw them dragging Desmond's lifeless body into the room. Pulling him by his arms, the two infected held up his body before the mass. He had been stripped naked, and his injuries looked much more severe, appearing as though he had been mostly hollowed out. The smaller tendrils around the mass stood up and wiggled in the air as though they were being puppeted by a sick ventriloquist. We watched in horror as the tendrils grew in size and stretched out towards Desmond's body, slithering into the holes. I felt sick as Desmond's skin proceeded to deform and gyrate like a blister stuffed with worms. The tendrils began breaking off of the mass and fully entering Desmond's body. Our co-worker's corpse suddenly lurched back, his back bent to a point of almost breaking. His arms and legs erratically waved around, almost as though it was testing the body's limits. I watched as a thicker tendril snaked its way out of Desmond's leg and crawled along the floor before finally reuniting with the mass in the center of the room. Desmond's body then turned and shambled underneath us, back in the direction he came. We sat there in the vent, slack-jawed and pale. Some say there are things humans weren't meant to see. I didn't believe them until that moment. Let's go, Peter said before tapping my leg and pointing me forward. I continued down the vent until the path made a sharp left turn. As I went around the corner, I stopped as I faced a tall metal wall. The ventilation shaft extended upward about 8 feet before continuing. I placed my back against the wall and began to pant. Peter shuffled up to where I was and looked up the shaft. "Fuck," he whispered. "What now?" Marcus asked. "Do you think there is another way if we funnel back?" "Probably not," Peter answered while looking at his wrist monitor. "There's a small staircase up ahead that leads to the control room. The vents have to move up a level to reach it. We've got to get up there." "All right," Marcus replied. "What's the game plan?" "I'll lift you up," Peter said as he looked at me. "You're the smallest of the three of us, so you'll go up first. After you're up, Marcus will lift me next. After I'm up top, I'll help pull Marcus." Marcus and I shared a glance. The metal floor beneath us creaked and groaned at every move. Could it really hold all that weight? Before we could protest, Peter's words snapped our attention. "We don't have time to wait. Stand up, let's get this over with." I stood and looked up at the ledge. It looked so far away in that moment. Peter grabbed me around the legs and lifted me. The metal creaked loudly and I threw my arms over the ledge. I expected to feel my weight give out from under me at any moment, that I would crash down on the violent mess below us. I held my breath and kicked up Peter's body as I pulled myself up to safety. I turned back and looked over the edge, giving a shaky thumbs up. Peter sighed and closed his eyes for a moment. "All right, Marcus, lift me up." Marcus stood up in the shaft and looked up at the ledge where I was. He sighed before bending down and grabbing Peter by the legs. I scooted back and stared at the ledge. After a few moments, I began to see Peter rise above the ledge, his arms grabbing at the rim. I smiled at Peter for a moment before a loud metallic pop caused me to jump. Peter's eyes widened, and I watched his form suddenly drop below the ledge with a large crash. I could hear Peter groaning as all I could see were his hands gripping the ledge. I crawled over and grabbed his wrists, looking over the edge to see that the vent panel had collapsed under the weight of Peter and Marcus. Marcus lay on the ground, calling out in pain. I adjusted my grip on Peter's arms and tried pulling him up. I then saw infected swarm over Marcus, his pained screams echoing through the metal vents. I pulled up on Peter as hard as I could, but I couldn't lift him on my own. "Take the key card!" Peter yelled, his face grimacing in fear. I hesitated for a moment. "Damn it, take it!" he ordered. I quickly released his arms and lifted the key card off his neck. "The wrist monitor, too," he groaned, sweat beading on his head. I reached down and unbuckled the monitor from his arm. "Get to the command deck. Send help. Don't look back. I'll try getting away." I nodded my head and turned back, scrambling quickly down the vent. I heard the metal hum as Peter released his grip, followed by a loud thud. I crawled as fast as I could, even as the sounds of Peter's screams filled the vent. I followed the map the best I could, winding back and forth through the ship. As I drew closer to the command center, the more my fear grew. Despite its crampedness, I wasn't in danger. What happens if I reach the command room and it's filled with infected? I couldn't go back. I would be out of options. As I began the final stretch to the control room, the vent began to shrink tighter. I had to lie on my stomach and shimmy along the tight corridor, the light coming from the slats being my only guidance forward. As I reached the slats, I let out a shaky sigh of relief. There was only one infected person in the room. It faced away from me, looking out the front window of the Rosen as though it were looking out towards Earth. I pulled out the pocket knife and shimmied it between the vent and the wall. Using it as a makeshift pry bar, I loosened the grate enough to force it off the wall with a hard shove. Even with the knowledge that the infected couldn't hear, I still shuddered as the grate clattered against the floor behind the hole-ridden man. I slid out of the vent and landed on my hands and knees. I stood to my feet, my back aching from the constant crawling, and walked over to the command room entrance. I looked down the hall to see it completely empty. It was just me and the one crewmate. And I had the element of surprise. Without warning, the ship suddenly rattled and shook, and many of the monitors suddenly beeped and blinked. I was confused for a moment before the realization dawned on me. It was the feeling of the engines coming to life. I looked down to see the long tendril trailing from the crewmate's leg back towards the mass in the mess hall. The infected in the room seemed to notice the sudden shake as well. I watched as the man slowly turned away from the window to face me, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. Seizing the moment, I reached down and grabbed the tendril, sliding my pocket knife underneath it and slicing the tendril in two. Immediately, the crewmate in the room began to convulse and thrash about in a confused manner. I ran up to the infected man, bringing my leg up and planting my foot hard into his hole-ridden chest. The man toppled back and landed on his back. He thrashed about in a feeble attempt to get up. Before he could get his bearings, I brought the heel of my foot down on the man's shins repeatedly, continuing until I heard the bones in each leg snap. Once I was sure the man was incapacitated, I ran to the communication monitor and began scrolling through to reach command on Earth. As I began work on establishing a connection, my eyes locked onto an anomaly on the monitor. The date was wrong. The date on the monitor read 2 weeks from that moment. Was it a bug? Some sort of electrical malfunction when the ship went through the wormhole? Then I saw the logs. Multiple entries, repair reports, and ration orders set over the 2 weeks that hadn't happened yet. The second to last report was a captain's order detailing that the Rosen would be landing on the surface to allow the engines to cool. This made no sense to me at the time. The Rosen was designed to travel long periods through space. For the engines to overheat would require a long-running flight in an atmosphere. On top of that, what surface is the captain referring to that the ship was supposed to land on? The ship had been in outer space for the past 5 months. I opened the final log, a crew maintenance report. As my eyes scanned the document, a cold chill like deep space itself ran over me. I have sabotaged the engines. I don't have much time. They are testing codes on the door. It will repair the engines eventually, but it will take them time. At the very least, it might buy enough time for someone else to figure out a way to stop it. If you are reading this, it knows about Earth. It longs for it. If it reaches our planet, it will spread. You see what it has done to us. We cannot let it get to our home. I pray this final act is not in vain. I love you, Samantha. I'm sorry I can't be there for you and Jack. My breath was shaky. I could feel beads of sweat forming on my face. The thing was repairing the ship so it could get to Earth. As I stared dumbfounded at the monitor, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching from behind. A large horde of the infected crew was shambling down the hall towards the command room, their corpse-like eyes locked onto me. At the front of the horde shambled Peter and Marcus, their broken bodies a sick mockery of the men I once knew. I ran to the hangar door and quickly swiped the key card and input the emergency code on the door monitor, shutting the large door and sending the command room into lockdown protocol. I could hear them banging on the door as I ran to the navigation module. I didn't have time to call for help. Once they were in this room, it wouldn't take them long until they steered the ship straight into Earth. They might just burn up in the atmosphere or land somewhere deep in the ocean. But I could stake the world on that chance. I opened the navigation module, pulling up a small depiction of our solar system in real time. I found the coordinates and hastily plugged them into the wormhole navigation system. The monitor on the door began to beep. They were testing codes now. The ship rattled and I heard the wormhole generator hum to life. I looked out the window, a small blue rock in a near-infinite universe. It was my home. I felt fear and grief roll over me as I realized I would never see it again. Suddenly Earth was gone, as was space. The ship now hovered about a mile over a surface of beautiful chaos, a plain that appeared to stretch out infinitely in all directions, a land that shifted in constant, unrecognizable patterns. It is made up of colors that are both familiar and indescribable. In the mess, I could see forests, mountains, and oceans all made up of alien features. Land masses folding in on themselves and becoming something entirely new. Beyond it all was a face. The visage of this world, this universe. It isn't something easily describable. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it so strongly that I might as well have been looking into its eyes. A being that both existed in this world and was at the same time, the world in its entirety. The being was so beautiful, but it caused my eyes to burn. They bled, and I had to look away from it. This was where they were, the folded space between our own. I crouched down and hid myself from the gaze of the world. The banging on the door has stopped. I suppose it realized I had taken it back to its home. It knows it lost. There is no point in hunting me now. I believe it has been about a day since I entered this folded space. That's what the date on the monitor says at least. It feels as though it has been longer. I figured I would try sending my story through the command message system. I doubt the message will send, and even if it does, I have no way of knowing where or when it might appear. Time doesn't seem to make any sense in this place. Hopefully, someone will read this and put an end to the Rosen travel project. I have kept myself locked in the command room. I don't know why. It isn't like I'll find a way to make it out of this ship alive. I sealed my fate when I put in those coordinates. I might be better off feeding myself to that thing in the mess hall. I don't know how long it will take for the wormhole to spit us out the other end, but part of me wants to try and stay alive long enough to see the end, to be there when the thing realizes there's no escape for it, to watch its surprise as it withers away in searing pain as the metal it's attached to melts against its putrid flesh, when the Rosen reaches its final destination, the surface of the sun.